The first thing Ray Holt noticed about the Draknari shuttle was that it landed wrong. Not the angle, not the speed, the sound. There was a knock in the engine cycle, a low, uneven thud that came once every 4 seconds, like something inside was trying to break free. Ray was eating his lunch on the floor of Bay 7 when the shuttle came through the docking seal. He put his food down before it even stopped moving. Vordak Station was not a beautiful place. It was a border hub, old and patched and held together by repair tape and habit. The walls sweated condensation. Half the lights in Bay 7 flickered. The whole station smelled like fuel and rust, and the specific kind of tired that comes from years of not enough budget and too much work. Ray had been here 6 years. He had stopped noticing the smell after the first 3 months. The Draknari shuttle was the opposite of Vordak Station. It was dark and angular, built from plates of deep green metal that caught the light like the scales of something alive. It was a military design, and it looked expensive. It looked like something that had no business being in Bay 7, on a station like this, in a part of space that most Draknari pretended did not exist. But here it was, and it was making that sound. 3 Draknari came down the ramp. The first was tall, armored, and moved like someone used to being obeyed. That was the female Dara. Ray learned the names later. The second was older, with pale green scales and a tight, controlled face. That was Torek, their engineer. The third was young, barely full-grown by Draknari measure, with darker scales and gold eyes that moved fast, taking in everything around him. That was Sovak. Sovak looked at the station the way someone looks at a shoe that has stepped in something unpleasant. Vral, the station chief, came fast. Vral was a Brellian, insectoid, 4 arms, always moving at least 2 of them. He spoke to Dara in clipped, polite terms. The manifold was cracked, he confirmed. His engineers had already looked. 2 weeks minimum, he said, maybe more. Dara's face did not change, but something around her eyes tightened. She had 48 hours before her escort window closed. After that, her route back through the Sovereignty's nav corridors would lock, and missing it carried consequences Ray did not fully understand and did not need to. Vral pulled Ray aside near the fuel lines. "I need you on this one," Vral said. "I heard the knock when it came in," Ray said. "Manifold crack is the symptom. The problem is probably further back." "My engineers say 2 weeks." "Your engineers are right if they do it their way." Ray looked at the shuttle. "I want to look at the core frame before I say anything." Vral said, "The Draknari won't like a human touching their ship." Ray picked up his toolbox. "They don't have to like it." He walked into the bay. Torek moved to block him at the ramp. There were words. Torek's translator clicked and buzzed and produced a version of them that was just barely polite enough to not be a direct order to leave. Ray waited until the words were finished. Then he said, "I'm going to walk around the outside of your ship and look at it. I'm not going to touch anything yet. If you want your manifold fixed in time, you will let me do that." He walked around the shuttle. Torek followed him, 2 steps back, watching. Sovak watched from the top of the ramp. He had his arms crossed. He was doing the thing young Draknari did when they wanted to look like they did not care, which was to look at something just to the side of what they were actually watching. He was watching Ray. Ray crouched near the rear undercarriage and put his hand near a seam in the hull plating. He did not touch it. He just felt the heat coming off it and looked at the way the plates sat. One of them had a slight bow, less than a centimeter. Most people would not see it. Ray saw it. He stood up and said to Vral, who had followed at a distance, "It's not a standard military frame. Someone put military plating over a modified civilian hull. The manifold crack is because the civilian core flexes differently under full burn. Every Draknari repair manual they have is written for a military hull. Everything Torek will try to do will be wrong for this specific ship." Vral looked at him. "Can you fix it?" Ray looked at the shuttle. The knock in the cycle had stopped now that the engine was off, but he could still hear it in his memory, that 4-second thud, patient and insistent. "I can fix it," he said. "Not in 2 weeks, maybe in 40 hours if nothing else breaks." "What do you need?" "For now, just keep Torek out of the engine bay." He went to get his full kit. Sovak was still at the top of the ramp when Ray came back. He said something in Draknari that the translator rendered as, "It took you long enough, ground crawler." Ray looked up at him. He said nothing. He went under the shuttle with a light and started working. 3 hours later, Ray had found and temporarily sealed 2 secondary stress fractures that Torek's initial assessment had missed entirely. He had also rerouted a coolant line that had been fighting the engine's natural pressure cycle for what looked like years. Small things, foundational things, the kind of things that made everything else possible. He heard a sound above him and looked out from under the hull. Sovak was standing a few meters away, not at the ramp anymore. He was closer. He was looking at the rerouted coolant line with an expression Ray could not fully read. The young Draknari did not say anything. He stood there for a moment and then he left. Ray went back to work. The engine bay of a Draknari shuttle was not built for humans. The ceilings were high enough, but the work platforms were angled for Draknari proportions, and the access hatches were positioned with the assumption that whoever reached inside would have claws. Ray had adapted. He had a set of extender handles he had made himself, years ago, for exactly this kind of job. He laid them out in order on the deck beside his kit and got to work. Torek arrived an hour into the second morning. He did not ask permission. He walked into the engine bay, looked at what Ray had done overnight, and began issuing new instructions to the station's drone assists in Draknari. The drones, which were synced to station control and therefore technically under Vral's authority, hesitated. Torek issued the instructions again, louder. Ray stood up from the conduit he was working on. "Those drones are not going to follow your rerouting order," he said, calm and flat, "because if they do, they will feed full pressure into a civilian spec valve that will not hold it. That valve will blow. The explosion will be small, but it will be inside the engine cavity, and it will set the repair back by 18 hours we do not have." Torek looked at him the way Draknari looked at something they found beneath comment. He gave the order to the drones again. Ray walked to the drone control panel on the bay wall and locked the drones to manual. He did it without hurrying, without raising his voice. He just did it. The temperature in the room changed. It was not the equipment. It was Torek. The old Draknari engineer stood very still, and in Ray's experience, the ones who went still were more dangerous than the ones who moved. Dara came in 3 seconds later, as if she had been listening from the corridor. She probably had been. She looked at the control panel, at Ray, at Torek. She said something to Torek in Draknari that the translator did not catch, too fast and too quiet. Torek's scales shifted and he stepped back, but his eyes did not leave Ray. Dara looked at Ray and said, "You locked our engineer out of our ship." "I locked the drones out of a mistake," Ray said. "Your engineer is welcome to use his hands. I use mine." She had no answer for that would have sounded reasonable, and she seemed to know it. She told Torek to wait outside. Torek left, but slowly. Sovak had been in the access corridor the whole time. Ray had seen him there through the bay door, watching. Ray went back to the conduit. The blow came 40 minutes later, not from Torek. From a secondary coupling on the port side that had been holding a pressure load Ray had not fully equalized yet. He had known it was stressed. He had not known how close it was to the edge. There was a crack, a sharp hiss, and then a jet of superheated gas came out of the coupling before the automatic seal kicked in. It caught Ray across the left forearm, not the worst burn he had ever taken. The third worst, maybe. He pulled his arm back, looked at it, and went to his kit for the medical wrap. He dressed it himself, tight and fast, the way he had been dressing burns since his first year on the job. Then he put his sleeve back down and went back to the coupling. Behind him, he heard footsteps. He assumed it was Vral coming to check the noise. A cup of water appeared beside his knee on the deck. Metal cup, station issue. He looked up. Sovak was standing there. The young Draknari was not looking at him. He was looking at the coupling, at the scorch mark on the wall, at the work in general. His face was turned slightly away, as if he had arrived by accident and happened to have water. Ray took the cup, he drank, he set it back down. Thanks, he said. Sovak said nothing. He walked away. His footsteps went back down the corridor and faded. Ray stared at the coupling. He thought about it for exactly 3 seconds, and then he stopped thinking about it and got back to work. He had 16 hours left on his internal estimate, and the manifold core was still waiting. That night, with the bay quiet and most of the station on low shift, Ray was resetting his tools when Vral came in and told him that the station's public archive had been accessed from a Draknari terminal at 200. Someone had pulled records on human labor contracts, the Accord war settlements, and pre-war human Draknari trade history. Vral did not say whose terminal. Ray did not ask. He cleaned his tools and went to sleep. The observation deck on Vordak Station had one thing going for it. The window was real glass, not screen, and real glass was rare on border stations. Someone decades ago had put it there, and it had survived every budget cut and retrofit since. Through it you could see the docking bays below, the fuel lines running between ships, and past all of that, the stars, which were thick and very still out here on the edge of Draknari space. Ray came up here on his rest breaks sometimes, not to think, just to be somewhere that was not metal and noise. He had a tin container of food, and he sat on the floor because the chairs were broken, and he looked at the stars and ate slowly. He had been there about 10 minutes when he heard the door. Sovak stopped when he saw Ray. He looked like he had expected the deck to be empty. He looked at Ray, then at the window, then at the door behind him. He did not leave. He walked to the window and stood there with his arms at his sides. His wings were folded tight against his back. He was not in his escort armor. He wore something simpler. He looked younger without the armor. He looked like what he was, which was a young person who had not yet learned how to be comfortable with things that did not fit into his categories. Ray finished a bite of food. Sovak said, without looking at him, "How do you stand it, living on a station like this?" "It pays," Ray said. "Humans will do anything for money." "Most things," Ray agreed, "same as most species." Sovak turned to look at him. He had not expected agreement. He said, "You are not angry when I insult you." "Anger takes energy," Ray said. "I have a manifold to finish." Sovak was quiet for a moment. He looked back at the window. Below, the half-repaired shuttle sat in its docking clamp. It looked smaller from here. He said, "How did you know it was a civilian frame?" Ray said, "The heat seams on the undercarriage run horizontal. Military frames run diagonal. Diagonal handles stress better. Horizontal is cheaper to manufacture." Sovak absorbed that. He said, "Torek has been our ship engineer for 20 years, and he did not see it." "Torek knows the manual," Ray said. "The manual covers what ships are supposed to be. This one is something else." The door opened. Neither of them had heard anyone coming. She was small, maybe 10 years old, with a station worker's worn-down jacket 2 sizes too big and a drawing pad under her arm. Nessa. Her father worked freight logistics on the lower deck. She had apparently been sneaking onto the observation deck for weeks to draw the ships. She stopped when she saw Sovak. Her eyes went wide, but not with fear, with something much more inconvenient for everyone, which was fascination. She said, "Are you a Draknari?" Sovak said, very slowly, "Yes." She walked closer. She tilted her head. She looked at his wings. She looked at his scales. She looked at his horns. She said, "Does the fire hurt when it comes out? From your throat, I mean." Sovak opened his mouth and closed it. He said, "No, it feels like a deep breath." She said, "Can your scales change color?" He said, "Only when we are very young." She said, "Are the horns heavy?" He reached up and touched one of his horns almost without meaning to. He said, "I stopped noticing." She nodded very seriously, opened her drawing pad, and began to sketch him with total concentration. Sovak stood completely still, as if he had been told to by someone whose authority he could not question, which was apparently a 10-year-old girl with a drawing pad. Ray finished his food and said nothing. After a while, someone called for Nessa from below, and she left, waving once without looking back. The observation deck was quiet again. Sovak was still standing where she had left him. Ray said, "She has never been told to be afraid of you." Sovak said after a moment, "What does that mean?" Ray said, "Everything you know about us, someone taught you, same as her, she just had a different teacher." Sovak said nothing. His jaw was tight. His eyes were on the window, but Ray did not think he was seeing the stars. He left without responding. Ray sat there a while longer, then he went back to the engine bay. He had 12 hours left on his estimate, and the hardest part was still ahead. Sovak kept thinking about the songs. Every Draknari hatchling learned them. They were sung in the creche, soft and slow, with words that seemed simple until you were old enough to understand what they were actually saying. There was one about the stars belonging to the strong, one about the enemies who wore soft skin and carried poison, one about how the great sovereignty was built to keep the small ones out. The small ones meant humans. He had known that since before he could fly. He thought about those songs while he stood outside the engine bay at hour 32 of the repair, watching Ray Holt work alone in the cavity of a ship that belonged to Sovak's family fleet. Ray had both arms inside the manifold housing, and he was talking to himself, very quietly, in a tone that was not frustration or complaint. It sounded more like problem-solving said out loud, like he was having a conversation with the engine. Dara appeared beside Sovak without announcement. She did not look at the engine bay, she looked at Sovak. She said, "Father's people have asked for updates." Sovak said, "Tell them the ship is being repaired." "They want to know by whom." Sovak said nothing. Dara said very quietly, "He has spent 2 days talking to you, making you useful to him." Sovak said, "He has not asked me for anything." "That is how it works," she said. "They make you feel useful, then later there is a price." Sovak said, "Has he asked us for anything, Dara? Any of it? Higher pay, access to our comm channels, information? Has he mentioned any of it once?" Dara was quiet. Sovak said, "He does not talk to me, I talk to him, and half the time he barely answers." She looked at the bay, at Ray, then she walked away. The manifold rethreading required 2 people. It was not possible to do it alone because one set of hands had to hold the alignment frame steady while the other worked the threading tool. If the frame shifted even slightly, the whole thing had to restart, and there were only so many restarts the timeline could survive. Every Draknari on the shuttle had been asked. Torek had refused so firmly that it had almost been physical. The others had followed his lead. Sovak walked into the engine bay without saying anything to Ray. He looked at the alignment frame where it sat in the manifold housing, waiting. He looked at how it needed to be held. He reached in and held it. Ray looked at him for a second. Then Ray picked up the threading tool and got to work. It was hard and hot, and they were pressed close together in a space made for one. Ray gave instructions in short, plain words: hold left, now steady, release slow, hold again. Sovak followed them. He found that he could anticipate some of them after a while. He found that the work had a rhythm, and once you heard it, you could move with it. Ray said at one point, "You have good hands for this." Sovak did not know what to do with that. He said nothing. Later, between cycles, while Ray was cooling the threading tool and checking the alignment, Sovak looked around the inside of the engine cavity. There was so much of it that had been touched by Ray's hands, rerouted, sealed, corrected. The whole interior had been quietly reorganized, not in a visible way, not in a way that changed how anything looked, but in a way that changed how everything worked. He thought about Torek, who had the best training money in the sovereignty could buy and had not seen the civilian frame for what it was. He thought about himself, who had spent his whole life being told what humans were, and had never once asked whether the people doing the telling had ever actually met one. He thought about Nessa, who had just asked questions. Ray said, "Ready for the second pass?" Sovak said, "Yes." They went back to work. When the second pass was done and Ray sat back against the engine wall to rest for 5 minutes, Sovak stayed where he was. He looked at his hands. His claws had grease on them from the frame housing. He said, "Do you hate us, Draknari?" Ray looked at the ceiling of the engine cavity. He said, "I've never had the time." Sovak did not know why that answer was the one that reached him when nothing else had, but it did. It landed somewhere behind his ribs and stayed there. He did not say anything else, neither did Ray. They sat in the hot, quiet cavity of the broken ship and rested, and then they went back to work. 40 hours after Ray Holt had first walked under the Draknari shuttle with a light and a kit, the engine bay of Vordak Station was more crowded than it had ever been. The Draknari shuttle sat in its clamp, fully sealed, all panels closed. Every cable had been pulled. Every drone had been docked. The work was done. What remained was the moment that would tell everyone whether the work meant anything. Vral stood at the diagnostics board with 2 of his engineers. Dara stood with Torek and 4 Draknari crew members near the blast wall. Ray stood by the manual override panel, which was his job during any engine test, because if something went wrong, he was the one who would know it fastest and could cut power before the problem became catastrophic. Nessa was at the observation window 1 level up. She had told her father she was doing homework. Sovak stood apart from his crew, closer to the center of the bay, in a space that was neither with the Draknari nor with the humans. He had been standing there since before anyone else arrived. Vral said, "Ray, whenever you are ready." Ray looked at the shuttle one more time. He had learned to trust the look more than the readings sometimes. The shuttle sat the way a thing sits when it has been put right. Level, still, no lean in the clamp, no vibration in the hull from pressure imbalance. It looked like a ship that was ready. He said, "Starting ignition sequence." He pressed the start sequence. The engine turned over. The sound was low at first, a deep rotation that climbed in pitch as the components found their timing. There was no knock. The 4-second thud that had announced the shuttle's arrival 2 days ago was gone completely. The sound climbed and stabilized, and the vibration on the bay floor was smooth, even, and correct. Every reading on Vral's board went green inside 15 seconds. Ray let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. The Draknari crew began to hum. It was not something Ray had heard before, a low resonance from the throat, almost below hearing. Felt more in the chest than the ears. Even Torek was doing it. Even Torek, who had not looked directly at Ray since the drone incident. Vral said, "Steady on all channels," and he sounded pleased, which for a Brullian was expressed by clicking 2 of his upper arms together in quick succession. Dara came across the bay to where Ray was standing. She stopped at a correct distance, formal and exact. She said, "The sovereignty acknowledges your work." Ray said, "Fly safe." She held his gaze for 1 additional second, which was, he suspected, more than she had intended. Then she returned to her crew. Sovak had not moved. Ray passed by him on his way to the tool cart and stopped. Sovak said, low enough that only Ray would hear, "I do not know what I believe anymore." He said it like it cost something. Ray said, "That is a good place to start." He kept walking. He got to the tool cart and began breaking down the setup, cables first, then the heavy mounts, then the smaller kit. He worked the way he always worked, without hurry, without performance. Just the next tool, then the next, then the next. Nessa was at the window. When she caught his eye, she held up her drawing pad. She had sketched the shuttle, and in the corner, very small, she had drawn what was clearly Sovak, with his wings half open and one hand raised. Ray nodded at her. She smiled and disappeared back to whatever she was supposed to be doing. Sovak stood in the center of the bay until his crew began moving toward the boarding ramp. Then he stopped looking at Ray and walked to join them. At the ramp, he paused for just a moment, not looking back, wings tight to his back. Then he went inside the ship. Ray loaded the last of his tools onto the cart and pushed it toward the equipment bay. 40 hours. No sleep past 3-hour blocks. His back ached, his arms still strung under the wrap, and he was hungry in the specific way that comes from ignoring hunger for too long. But the engine ran clean. That was the part that mattered. The shuttle was 2 hours from departure when Sovak came to find Ray. Ray was in the lower access corridor outside Bay 7, recalibrating a fuel sensor that had been reading slightly wrong for a month, and which no one had bothered him about until now. He was on his back on the floor with the panel open above him when he heard the footsteps. The gate was too heavy and too deliberate to be human. He slid out and looked up. Sovak stood there in his full escort armor, which meant he was ready to board. He was holding something at his side, pinched between two claws. It was a scale, dark green with a deep metallic sheen, roughly the length of Ray's hand. It was smooth on one side and slightly ridged on the other. Ray got to his feet. He wiped his hands on his work cloth. Sovak held the scale out without speaking. He was not looking at Ray's face. He was looking slightly past him, in the way of someone who has decided to do something and is committed to finishing it, but has not worked out how to look at it directly. Ray knew enough about Draknari customs from 6 years of border station life to know that a shed scale given by hand was not a transaction. It was not diplomatic. It was personal in a way that most Draknari would not do in front of witnesses. He took it. Sovak lowered his arm. He gave a single, short nod that was very precise and controlled. Then he turned and walked back toward the bay without looking back. Ray stood in the corridor holding the scale. He looked at it for a while. Then he put it in his chest pocket, picked up his sensor tool, and got back on the floor to finish the calibration. 3 months passed. Inside the Sovereignty's command vessel, in a room that had high stone ceilings and cold blue lighting and 40 years of war decisions made inside its walls, Fleet Commander Vorath sat at the head of a long table. His scales were battle grey and his eyes were old. He held a single printed letter, which in a civilization that ran on digital communication meant it had been written with intention. His son had sent it through a personal courier, the kind used only when the sender did not want the message going through official channels. Vorath read it aloud. He did not summarize, he read every word. The letter described a station on the edge of sovereign space. It described a cracked manifold. It described a human mechanic who had looked at their ship for 5 minutes and seen what their own engineers had missed. It described a burn on a forearm and how the man dressed it himself and went back to work without a word. It described a small girl who had asked questions about Draknari anatomy with the enthusiasm of a scholar and the fear of someone who has never been told to be afraid. It described 40 hours of work done with nothing asked in return. At the end, Sovak had written, "I was raised to believe that humans take. I watched one give and not once looked to see if anyone noticed." Vorath set the letter down. One of the admirals said, "What is your son proposing?" Vorath said, "He is not proposing anything. He is reporting what he saw." Another admiral said, "He is young. He was impressed by a trick." Vorath said, "He is young. He saw something without doctrine in his eyes. Those are not the same criticism." The room was quiet, not comfortable quiet, the tense quiet of old beliefs under pressure. One of them said, "We cannot base policy on a letter about a mechanic." Vorath said, "No, but we might ask why we have 300 years of policy built on something we have been equally reluctant to examine." Nobody had an answer that would have sounded honest. The debate went for 4 hours and resolved nothing. These things never resolve in one session, but the room was different at the end than it had been at the beginning, and everyone in it knew it, even the ones who would not admit it. On Vordak Station, Ray was under a new engine. It was a cargo hauler with a cracked compression ring and a coolant leak that had been ignored for too long. Straightforward job, 3 hours, maybe 4. He had his tools laid out beside him in the order he would use them, the way he always did. Vraul appeared at the edge of the deck. He slid a printed data slip across the floor without bending down. His upper arms were doing the clicking thing that meant he was pleased. Ray reached out and took it without getting up. He read it. It was a contract offer. A Draknari engineering consortium based out of the Inner Sovereignty was looking for a human technical advisor, someone to consult on non-standard hull configurations. First contract of its kind in 300 years. The pay number at the bottom was not a number Ray had ever seen with his name attached to it. He read it twice. Then he folded it and put it in his chest pocket, next to the scale that he still carried without thinking about it anymore. He picked up his first tool. He had 3 more jobs before end of shift. He could think about the letter later. The compression ring was not going to fix itself. He worked